four players that the Indiana Fever should core to make sure that no team can touch them heading into the expansion. Remember, you just lose these players straight up. You don't get anything back for the players. They're gone. We didn't get anything for Temi, did we?
The Indiana Fever have completely taken over headlines and social media, turning into one of the hottest topics in basketball. Everywhere you turn, people are discussing the team. Sports shows can't stop debating their future. Podcasts break down every little moment. After each matchup, social media erupts with non-stop reactions. But what if the real story has nothing to do with what's happening during games? What if the wins, losses, and highlight plays have only distracted fans from the deeper issues unfolding behind the scenes? Rumors about serious tension inside the locker room have now grown impossible to dismiss. Beyond the flashy highlights, polished interviews, and carefully controlled media appearances, reports suggest the situation internally has reached a breaking point. Many believe head coach Stephanie White finally decided to step in, making the shocking choice to move on from four players in rapid succession after what may have been months of planning. But was this simply about reshaping the roster and making the hard decisions every championship organization eventually faces? Or was it a desperate move to regain control of a team that appeared to be spiraling toward complete chaos? As more details about the Fever's internal struggles continue to surface, fans and analysts across the basketball world have watched with equal parts fascination, concern, and disbelief. What began as quiet whispers in arena hallways and scattered anonymous reports has now exploded into a major organizational controversy that could destroy what many expected to be a defining season for the franchise. The biggest question everyone keeps asking remains incredibly simple: what truly happened in Indianapolis? To fully understand the current situation, you have to look back at where this franchise once stood. The Indiana Fever were not always surrounded by uncertainty and drama. Just a few years ago, they were viewed as one of the league's model organizations. Their arena represented consistency, professionalism, and winning culture. Championship banners hung proudly above the court, while loyal fans continued to support the franchise with passion and energy. But professional sports can be unforgiving, and eventually the Fever reached the difficult crossroads every franchise faces sooner or later: rebuild or slowly fade into irrelevance. Hiring Stephanie White was never viewed as a rushed decision. Team executives reportedly spent countless hours reviewing footage from her previous coaching jobs, conducting extensive meetings, and gathering opinions from respected voices around the league. White brought an impressive resume and years of basketball experience at multiple levels of the game. Having both played and coached in Indiana before, she already understood the pressure, expectations, and culture surrounding the organization. Many believed she was exactly the type of leader capable of restoring the toughness, discipline, and defensive mindset that once defined Fever basketball. At the very same time, the franchise made another massive decision by selecting a once-in-a-generation talent in the draft. The moment Caitlin Clark's name was called on draft night, the arena erupted with excitement. Fans instantly felt renewed hope. Media coverage exploded everywhere. Inside the organization, executives saw enormous opportunity through ticket demand, merchandise sales, sponsorship growth, and primetime television exposure. Clark represented everything modern basketball had become: electric, fearless, creative, and impossible to ignore. Yet during all of that excitement, almost nobody stopped to ask one critical question. What happens when a player who thrives in fast-paced chaos joins forces with a coach built around strict discipline and structure? What happens when a franchise builds its identity around a superstar, but hires a coach who refuses to believe any player deserves special treatment? Looking back now, many believe those decisions planted the foundation for the turmoil unfolding today. Moves that initially appeared brilliant but may have been completely incompatible from the beginning. The warning signs were there all along for anyone paying close attention. At first they were subtle, barely noticeable, but week after week they became harder to ignore. Long before the controversy exploded publicly, experienced reporters and league insiders who had spent years around the WNBA quietly sensed that something inside the organization felt off. To the average fan watching games from home, it simply looked like a team adjusting to a new system while dealing with the normal struggles that come with roster changes. Every team experiences growing pains, after all. New players need time to understand the playbook. Chemistry doesn't develop overnight. Coaching staffs need weeks to figure out lineups and rotations. Those are the standard explanations repeated after disappointing losses and used by organizations to calm concerned fans. But people with direct access to practices, team meetings, and internal conversations describe something far more troubling: a deep clash of philosophies and personalities that was beginning to tear apart the locker room. Stephanie White entered the season with a strong reputation around basketball circles for her demanding, defense-first mentality and no-nonsense coaching style. Now she found herself leading a roster filled with some of the league's most explosive offensive talent. Her coaching history had always been built on discipline, structure, accountability, and grinding through every possession with intensity. Defense came before everything else. She believed opponents should have to earn every single point. Every team experiences growing pains, after all. New players need time to understand the playbook. Chemistry doesn't develop overnight. Coaching staffs need weeks to figure out lineups and rotations. Those are the standard explanations repeated after disappointing losses and used by organizations to calm concerned fans. But people with direct access to practices, team meetings, and internal conversations describe something far more troubling: a deep clash of philosophies and personalities that was beginning to tear apart the locker room. Stephanie White entered the season with a strong reputation around basketball circles for her demanding, defense-first mentality and no-nonsense coaching style. Now she found herself leading a roster filled with some of the league's most explosive offensive talent. Her coaching history had always been built on discipline, structure, accountability, and grinding through every possession with intensity. Defense came before everything else. She believed opponents should have to earn every single point. Her offensive systems relied on precision, clear roles, and players executing within a carefully organized framework. Authority mattered to her. Hierarchy mattered to her. But this situation went beyond ordinary disagreements over basketball tactics or strategy, the kind of conflict that can usually be solved through compromise and adjustments. What was happening inside Indiana became a battle over the team's entire identity. Inside practices, film sessions, and locker room discussions, two completely different visions of basketball were colliding. It became old-school philosophy against modern creativity, freedom versus structure, experience versus innovation. And like every internal war, there were always going to be casualties. Anyone watching carefully could feel the tension growing stronger by the game. During timeouts, the body language alone revealed a disconnect that no press conference could hide. Players appeared to listen during defensive breakdowns, nodding along while exchanging uncertain glances during offensive discussions. Certain teammates quietly showed frustration whenever specific plays were called, while others reacted negatively when someone attempted shots outside the design system. Even the bench atmosphere shifted constantly, reflecting a roster struggling to stay united. After a major defensive stop, the entire bench would jump up celebrating together. Yet after offensive highlights, some players barely reacted at all, remaining seated and clapping half-heartedly. Veteran observers around the league recognized the signs immediately because they had seen similar situations destroy teams before. Sources close to the organization reportedly described rival groups forming inside the locker room, heated conversations happening behind closed doors, and a coaching staff slowly losing its grip on the roster. One insider even claimed that during a practice, White repeatedly stopped drills to correct offensive spacing, only for a player to point out that the so-called incorrect positioning had actually created an open scoring opportunity moments earlier. Another insider described a film session where the divide inside the locker room became impossible to miss, both literally and emotionally. Several players sat near the front of the room, listening closely and agreeing with Stephanie White's breakdowns, while others stayed in the back rows with folded arms, appearing distant and completely uninterested. Behind the scenes, the organization reportedly tried everything possible to keep the situation from falling apart. Executives quietly held meetings with key players, brought in sports psychologists to improve chemistry, and even reached out to respected coaches around the league for advice on managing difficult personalities and locker room tension. But eventually, the truth always finds a way to surface. Like cracks slowly forming in a dam under growing pressure, the issues inside the organization kept building until there was no longer any way to hide or dismiss them. As the season progressed, the internal conflict began showing itself publicly in ways the team could no longer cover up. The Fever's performances became wildly inconsistent, swinging between dominant victories and shocking collapses. One night they looked like legitimate championship contenders, moving the ball beautifully on offense while suffocating opponents defensively. The very next game, they would struggle against weaker teams, appearing disconnected, frustrated, and lacking energy. Post-game interviews slowly transformed into exercises in decoding hidden messages. White frequently emphasized commitment, discipline, and trusting the system, comments many interpreted as frustration toward players who were not fully buying in. Meanwhile, players responded with careful, politically safe answers about still learning each other and continuing to build chemistry, phrases that only fueled speculation about deeper frustrations beneath the surface. As reporters started noticing the tension, media questions became increasingly direct, focusing more on locker room unity, coaching philosophy, and whether the roster was truly on the same page. At the same time, social media quietly turned into another battlefield where the divide revealed itself in subtle ways. Players who once constantly interacted online suddenly stopped engaging with one another's posts. Certain athletes began sharing cryptic quotes about staying true to yourself or refusing to let others dim your shine. Messages fans immediately viewed as indirect shots at someone within the organization. Supporters started creating long investigative threads analyzing every little detail: who attended team events together, which players seemed isolated, who looked genuinely happy, and who appeared emotionally checked out. Behind closed doors, the disconnect reportedly continued growing worse. Multiple anonymous sources claimed team meetings had become tense, frustrating, and increasingly unproductive. White continued pushing for a disciplined style centered around defensive intensity and controlled offensive execution. Meanwhile, several players reportedly preferred a faster, more free-flowing system built around creativity and pace. Neither side seemed willing to fully compromise because both genuinely believed their own approach gave the team the best chance to win. Reports suggested the coaching staff itself had become fractured behind the scenes. Several assistant coaches closely aligned with Stephanie White fully supported her defensive mindset and detail-oriented philosophy because they believed in her long-term vision for the team. However, other assistants, especially those who had spent more years inside the organization, quietly questioned whether the system was truly allowing the roster's offensive talent to thrive. As disagreements among coaches grew, players reportedly began noticing the lack of a unified direction coming from the bench. Practices gradually became more uncomfortable and emotionally draining. Basic drills started turning into tense debates instead of productive sessions. White often dedicated long stretches of practice to defensive positioning, rotations, and structure, something certain players reportedly viewed as restrictive and over-controlled. During scrimmages, the competitive atmosphere became even more obvious, with possessions often turning into showcases of individual talent rather than smooth team basketball. Some players appeared determined to prove that their faster, more instinctive style could succeed without being heavily controlled. Meanwhile, the front office found itself trapped in an increasingly impossible position. The organization had invested heavily in both White and the star talent they had built their future around. Firing a recently hired head coach so quickly would create massive backlash, but abandoning the players who had become the face of the franchise also felt impossible. Executives reportedly attempted to play mediator by holding separate meetings with White and influential members of the roster, hoping to create compromise and restore stability. But mediation only works when both sides are willing to bend, and by that stage it appeared everyone had become deeply committed to their own beliefs. Veteran players who had experienced similar locker room situations in previous seasons quietly began expressing concerns about where things were headed. They had already witnessed talented teams collapse because of internal tension and knew how quickly unresolved conflict could destroy an entire season. Some reportedly tried stepping into peacemaker roles, attempting to calm disagreements and reconnect divided groups inside the locker room. Instead, they allegedly found themselves feeling isolated, caught between two sides that no longer trusted each other. As the divide continued growing, remaining neutral became almost impossible. Then everything changed with the first major move, a sudden decision that sent shockwaves throughout the organization and across the league. Without much warning, the Fever released an important rotation player who had consistently contributed on the court and was respected inside the locker room. The message behind the move felt unmistakable: either fall in line or risk being pushed out. There would be no more second chances and no more quiet warnings. The timing stunned nearly everyone around the team. It wasn't the off-season, when roster changes usually feel more understandable and expected. It also didn't happen immediately after a devastating loss that might emotionally justify drastic action. Instead, the release came during what appeared publicly to be a relatively stable stretch of the season, making the decision feel even more shocking. According to reports, the player was called into a brief meeting, informed they were being released, given only a minimal explanation, and then escorted out as their time with the franchise abruptly ended. Officially, the organization described the move using familiar front office language about roster flexibility, analytics, and changing direction. But around league circles, insiders began circulating a far more dramatic version of events. Anonymous sources claimed the player had become one of the loudest critics of White's coaching philosophy and overall direction for the team. They reportedly voiced frustrations openly during meetings instead of limiting those conversations to private discussions among teammates. According to insiders, the player frequently challenged defensive schemes they believed limited the offensive creativity and natural instincts of the roster. Over time, they allegedly became the unofficial spokesperson for a growing group of frustrated players who privately shared similar concerns but hesitated to openly challenge the coaching staff themselves. Many around the league interpreted the release as a calculated power move, a direct warning to a locker room already divided by tension and competing visions. Sources claimed the player had openly argued that modern basketball could no longer succeed with outdated systems focused too heavily on control and structure. Whether true or exaggerated, the message behind the decision felt crystal clear. Stephanie White was making it known that public criticism would not be tolerated, her authority would not be questioned, and complete commitment to her system was no longer optional. It no longer mattered how talented you were, how respected you had become inside the locker room, or how many years you had spent with the organization. If your views conflicted with the coach's direction, you could be removed at any moment. The timing of that first release made the situation even more unsettling. It didn't happen during the chaos of the opening weeks of the season or around an obvious turning point like the All-Star break. Instead, the move arrived completely out of nowhere, catching even longtime league observers off guard. To many people around the organization, it suggested that White and the front office had been quietly planning their response for quite some time, watching closely, documenting moments of resistance, and building toward a decisive action. Rather than reacting emotionally, they appeared patient and calculated, allowing frustration and disagreement inside the locker room to fully reveal itself before stepping in. Reports claimed the reaction among players was immediate and emotional. Friends of the released player were said to be devastated after hearing the news. Some reportedly broke down in tears, but beneath the sadness was an even stronger feeling spreading throughout the roster: fear. If someone with that player's status and role could suddenly disappear, then nobody felt truly safe anymore. Performance, popularity, and relationships within the organization suddenly seemed meaningless. The only thing that mattered now was loyalty to the system. In private conversations, several players allegedly expressed disbelief and quietly reached out to support their former teammate. Others publicly backed the organization's decision, posting messages online about trusting the process and remaining focused on team goals. Whether those statements came from genuine belief or simple self-preservation, They sent a clear signal throughout the locker room about which players fully stood beside White. Media coverage surrounding the release quickly exploded, though most reports remained surface level because reporters struggled to uncover the deeper reasons behind the move. Analysts focused heavily on statistics and tried debating whether the players' production justified keeping a roster spot. But people paying close attention sensed that numbers were never the true issue. This situation was about power, authority, and sending a warning message to everyone inside the organization, and that message had been received loud and clear. Then things escalated even further. Only days later, 2 additional players were released in rapid succession, almost as if the entire sequence had been carefully planned in advance. Before the shock from the first move had fully settled, the second release arrived just 3 days later. Less than a week after that came the third. Individually, those roster moves might have looked like ordinary mid-season adjustments or the type of changes struggling teams regularly make while searching for answers. After all, roster turnover is common in professional basketball when results are disappointing. Roster moves are part of professional basketball. Sometimes a player simply doesn't fit within a coach's system. Other times, a new addition makes someone's role expendable. Financial concerns, future signings, or strategic adjustments can also force difficult decisions. Any one of those releases on its own could have been explained away as an unfortunate but necessary business move. But taken together, the pattern painted a far more calculated and troubling picture. This no longer looked like ordinary roster management. It appeared to be a deliberate effort to remove players who challenged Stephanie White's authority and silence growing resistance inside the locker room. The approach was targeted, ruthless, and incredibly effective. White wasn't just reshaping the team, she seemed to be clearing out anyone she believed threatened her control over the organization. For weeks before the releases, rumors had already circulated about cliques forming and team chemistry deteriorating. Sources claimed players had begun separating themselves during team dinners, a classic sign of a fractured locker room. One table reportedly consisted of star players, another of veterans, and another of younger teammates. But according to insiders, the real divide had nothing to do with age or experience. The separation was ideological. One group fully believed in White's disciplined approach, while the other questioned whether the system was truly working. Fans also started noticing unusual behavior on social media, another warning sign often linked to internal tension. Players who once constantly interacted online suddenly stopped liking or commenting on each other's posts. Carefully selected team photos seemed to avoid showing certain teammates together. The chemistry that successful teams naturally display began feeling forced, rehearsed, and designed purely for public appearance. Even celebrations during games appeared different. Players still hugged after big moments, but the reactions looked performative instead of genuine, almost as if everyone understood the cameras were watching. Through these back-to-back releases, Stephanie White appeared to be performing surgery on the roster, cutting out what she believed was the source of the locker room's problems before the frustrations spread further. According to league insiders, she identified specific players as threats to the culture she wanted to build and removed them with precision. One of the released players reportedly shared a very close friendship with the first player who had been cut, leading many to believe the move had less to do with basketball performance and more to do with breaking connections inside the locker room. They had become extremely close off the court, often traveling together, spending time together after practices, and building a bond that extended well beyond basketball. To White, that friendship allegedly became dangerous because united voices carry more influence than isolated ones. The difficult part was that the player had actually been contributing positively during games. They defended well, shot efficiently, and handled their responsibilities within the offensive system. But at that stage, performance no longer seemed to matter. Their real mistake, according to many around the league, was standing too closely beside the wrong people. By removing them, White reportedly sent another unmistakable message throughout the roster: personal relationships would not protect anyone. Friendships inside the locker room meant nothing if loyalty to the system was in question. Sources also claimed another player released during the stretch had privately complained about their playing time and overall role within the offense. White allegedly viewed those frustrations as signs of selfishness and entitlement that could poison the culture she was trying to establish. That player reportedly believed they deserved more opportunities to create offensively, more freedom to improvise, and a larger role in the team's attack. In private conversations, they questioned why every offensive possession needed to follow such a rigid structure and why players weren't allowed to rely more on instinct and creativity during games. From a pure basketball perspective, some of those frustrations may have been completely understandable. But from Stephanie White's point of view, they represented something much more dangerous, a direct challenge to her authority as head coach. A coach's control ultimately depends on the ability to define roles, distribute minutes, and establish how the team operates. Once players openly begin questioning those decisions, the foundation of the entire system starts to weaken. White reportedly understood that if those challenges continued unchecked, she risked losing control of the locker room entirely. So the message being sent to the remaining roster became impossible to misunderstand. White was willing to sacrifice depth, experience, and even talent in order to protect something she valued more: complete loyalty to her philosophy and total commitment to her system. On paper, the Fever were becoming thinner, less versatile, and far more vulnerable to injuries or fatigue. But White appeared convinced that a roster fully united behind her approach would always be more dangerous than a talented team divided by internal conflict. It was an extremely risky gamble that could ultimately shape the future of the entire franchise. If the remaining players fully embraced White's defense-first mentality and structured offensive system, the Fever could develop the type of chemistry and trust that allows less talented teams to outperform more gifted opponents through effort, discipline, and cohesion. Teams like that often become incredibly difficult to beat because every player completely buys into the same mission. But there was also another possibility, one far more dangerous. If the purge created fear, resentment, and emotional exhaustion instead of unity, the season could spiral out of control. Players might become overly cautious, constantly worried about making mistakes, speaking too openly, or ending up as the next person removed from the roster. Instead of playing freely and creatively, they could start operating like robots, stripped of the confidence and energy necessary to succeed at the highest level. Publicly, the coaching staff reportedly stood firmly behind every decision that had been made. Assistant coaches reinforced White's vision during conversations with players, emphasizing the importance of discipline, accountability, and full commitment to the team's defensive identity. Yet behind closed doors, reports suggested not everyone on the staff felt completely comfortable with how far things had gone. Some assistants allegedly worried about how thin the roster had become after so many departures in such a short period of time. Others privately questioned whether the remaining players could consistently handle the pressure and still perform at a high level. Most concerning of all, several reportedly feared that the emotional damage caused by the locker room purge might never fully disappear, even if the team started winning games again.